Milei is not a conservative. He gives talks at conservative conferences. He's friends with conservative politicians like Trump and Maloney. He talks about his religious faith. He talks about cutting taxes, regulations, and the budget, like conservatives always talk about but never do. And the press describes him as a conservative.
Let's start with this huge development in Argentina, which has just elected a president that is conservative.
Even the press describes him as conservative. How can you possibly say Milei is not conservative? Are you going to say just because he likes tantric sex and because he has cloned his dogs and he played in a rock and roll band, he's not conservative? He also called the Pope a filthy leftist. He's not married, and his sister, who he calls the boss, is the acting First Lady of Argentina. So if you don't think Milei is a conservative, what do you think he is? First of all, Milei never described himself as a conservative. He's described himself as many things. He's described himself as a new growth economist, a mathematical economist, an Austrian economist, and an anarcho-capitalist. But most often in his speeches, he calls himself a liberal libertarian. And Milei started his own political party rather than join the Conservative Party in Argentina. In case you don't believe me, here's Milei calling himself a libertarian liberal over and over again.
Argentina has the first libertarian liberal president in the history of humanity.
For those of you who are not aware, I'm not a politician. I'm an economist. I'm a liberal libertarian economist who never aimed to be a politician, but who was honored to become the President of the Republic of Argentina following the resounding failure of more than a century of collectivist policies that destroyed our country.
Imagine how bad things had to be for society to elect the first liberal and libertarian president in history. Something that in normal conditions of depression and temperature does not happen, right? Without a political party near the governors or mayors. Basically, the bet of the previous government was that they did not believe that we were libertarian liberals. In reality, we are libertarian liberals. In fact, in the public debate, they are going to find quite a few libertarians. The citizens elected the first liberal, libertarian president, without a political party, nor governors, nor mayors. Obviously, under normal conditions of pressure and temperature, there are no liberal libertarian presidents.
So what is a liberal libertarian? And what's a conservative? And why did Milei align with the conservatives? By libertarian liberal, I believe Milei means a classical liberal, in the style of John Locke. Milei quotes Locke's The Right to Life, Liberty, and Property over and over in his speeches. In fact, I did a montage video on this. But how does this differ than being a conservative? I believe Milei is very careful in the words he chooses, and he knows the history of conservatism, which very few people do. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, I told my father I didn't like the idea of calling myself a conservative. And he said, well, just think of it as being conservative with other people's money. That's not the definition of being a conservative. Here's a clip from a pretty good video on what it is to be a conservative.
And when I identify myself as a conservative, what I'm really saying is that I am a classical conservative. And when I say classical conservative, I'm really identifying myself with a particular strain of thought within conservatism that goes all the way back to Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke, I'll be doing another video at some point on Edmund Burke, but he's considered the founder of modern conservatism, a British thinker, parliamentarian. So conservatism does not have a manifesto. There is no conservative manifesto I can point you to and say, well, all the conservatives have this. There's no statement of faith of the conservative mindset. It's not considered an ideology, more so a temperament than anything else. So if we're thinking about conservatism and how to define it, authors who would consider themselves conservatives have defined that term often with a number of tenets. The first principle I'm outlining here is reform over revolution. The second point is that the conservative recognizes the value of the inheritance of culture, customs, and institutions that they have received in their society. So Burke has been seen as kind of an anti-Enlightenment thinker. The third point that I have here is the inevitability of hierarchy.
So we found out that conservatism isn't an ideology. It's more of an attitude or temperament. And what do you think of a temperament would be of a conservative? It'd be to conserve, which means it would be distrustful of reason and quick changes, which is why, despite having elected Republicans to both the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they were never able to repeal Obamacare, and we still have the Department of Education, despite the fact that every Republican president said they'd eliminate the Department of Education. So what does Milei think of this cautious, go slow approach?
We govern without fear, applying sharp measures to generate confidence in society and in the market. Not only because those are our convictions, but because empirical evidence also accompanies us. For 1952 onwards, all these shock programs, including the one in 1959, were expansive in activity and employment, and all gradualist programs ended badly. Second, we did not compromise with the enemy. The other fallacy that reformist politicians tend to apply is the fallacy of consensus. Most of the reformist experience is cash against the political class, who tell them that they must compromise their reforms with them.
We also found out that Edmund Burke is considered the father of modern conservatism. Edmund Burke got his fame from critiquing the French Revolution. He claimed that the excesses of the French Revolution were due to the fact that they didn't respect the traditions and customs of the French people, which leads him to his reform, not revolution argument. He argues that every revolution always ends badly. He pretends that the American Revolution wasn't a revolution, it was actually a conservative reform. While Burke pretends that he's concerned about the French Revolution, what he's really doing is providing a defense of the English monarchy. And it's an attack on the Enlightenment thinkers like Locke, Newton, Bacon, Jefferson, Madison, and many American founding fathers. Burke ignores the obvious differences between the French and the American Revolution. The French Revolution was based on Rousseau's ideas. The American Revolution was based on Locke's ideas. In the French Revolution, rights of man said that it was limited by the needs of society. This means that the so-called rights in the French Revolution were a socialist or collectivist idea. Burke was also suspicious of the ideas of the Enlightenment. He felt that reason had to be tempered by tradition and customs. And similar to the Scottish Enlightenment, he felt that reason and emotion were both valid epistemological tools. Milei, on the other hand, clearly believes in the power of reason. He also does not believe that there are any limits to the rights of life, liberty, and property. Milei is clearly a Locke fan, not a Rousseau fan, not a Burke fan either. Another disturbing thing about Burke and conservatives is that he felt that human nature was inherently flawed and had to be constrained by social, moral, and institutional norms in order to prevent the excesses of individual passions and interests. Milei, on the other hand, clearly believes that human nature is good. I believe that many people who call themselves conservatives have no idea that they're subscribing to all these ideas. And in fact, they are classical liberals or aspirational anarcho-capitalists. I believe that Hayek provided one of the best definitions of a conservative. He argued when describing his ideas on cultural evolution that rules, norms, and practices evolve in a process of natural selection operating at the group level. Thus, the groups that have the more efficient rules and practices tend to grow and multiply and ultimately displace the other groups. Milei is a political and economic genius and wanted to distance himself from some of these conservative tenets. So why does he associate with so many conservative politicians? First of all, I think that many of these so-called conservative politicians are actually confused. They're actually classical liberals. And to the extent they are not classical liberals, he wants to be an example for what they can do if they follow the ideas of freedom and Locke and reason. He also is willing to make friends with anyone who's going to go down the path towards liberty, because he sees the biggest threat as the Marxist collectivists in all its forms: social, environmental, and economic. Long live freedom, damn it.